Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the marble-columned chaos of ancient Greece, where philosophers didn't just debate ideas, they argued so relentlessly, so obnoxiously, that entire city-states had to pass laws just to make them stop. Picture this, you're standing in the Athenian agora at sunset, the air thick with olive oil smoke and the heated voices of men in togas who've had way too much watered-down wine. Somewhere behind a column, a bearded guy is lecturing about the nature of reality to anyone unfortunate enough to make eye contact. You probably won't survive this without questioning everything you thought you knew about ancient wisdom, because tonight you're discovering that half the rules governing Greek society existed purely because one philosopher wouldn't shut up. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing the global bedtime crew roll in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in Athens, around 380 BCE, and you've just watched the sun dip below the Acropolis. The marketplace is finally cooling down, but the city isn't settling. Music drifts from a symposium 2 streets over, high-pitched Daulos flutes mixing with drunken singing that makes your teeth hurt. You duck into a side street, hoping for quiet, but there's Plato, mid-rant, surrounded by a cluster of young aristocrats who should have gone home hours ago. He's gesturing wildly, explaining why this exact kind of evening entertainment is rotting Athens from the inside out. You've heard this speech before. Everyone has. Plato despises what he calls corrupting music, the kind that makes people lose their rational minds and dance like they've forgotten they're supposed to be philosopher citizens. Here's where it gets weird. Plato wasn't just complaining into the void. He was so convincing, so persistent in his dialogues and public lectures, that Athens actually started regulating nighttime entertainment. The city began enforcing curfews on certain musical performances, particularly those involving the aulos, which Plato deemed too emotionally stimulating. He argued in the Republic that specific musical modes and rhythms could destabilize a person's soul, making them weak, lustful, or rebellious. Imagine someone today arguing that trap music should be illegal after 9 p.m. because it disrupts civic virtue. That's essentially what Plato pulled off. You watch as city officials, influenced by decades of Platonic preaching, start showing up at symposia to monitor the vibe. They're checking whether the music adheres to the proper Dorian or Phrygian modes, which Plato approved of for their martial, disciplined character. Anything too wild, too Lydian or Ionian, those soft, feminine scales, get shut down. The flute player looks confused as a magistrate explains that his instrument choice is philosophically problematic. This is real. This actually happened in various Greek city-states influenced by Platonic thought. Historians still argue whether Plato's musical regulations were ever formally codified into Athenian law or remained more as cultural norms enforced by social pressure. But what's undeniable is that his aesthetic philosophy created a framework where artistic expression became a matter of state concern. The idea that music could engineer souls, for better or worse, wasn't just abstract theory. It translated into who could perform what, when, and for whom. You follow the disgruntled musicians as they pack up their instruments early, muttering about philosophers who've never played a note telling everyone else what sounds good. One of them jokes that next Plato will regulate how people laugh or which emotions are permitted at funerals. He's not far off. Plato's Laws, his final and most detailed political work, literally prescribes state oversight of festivals, performances, and even the types of stories parents can tell children. The man created a blueprint for a surveillance state built on aesthetic principles. The quirky part? Plato himself was reportedly terrible at music. Ancient biographers mention he struggled with rhythm and melody, which might explain why he trusted mathematical ratios and philosophical reasoning over actual artistic practice. There's something darkly funny about a tone-deaf philosopher convincing an entire civilization to restructure its entertainment industry according to his theories about harmonic perfection. You lean against a wall as another group of young men stumbles past, clearly having ignored the new restrictions. They're singing something bawdy, completely off-key, and you wonder how long before someone enforces Plato's vision more strictly. The answer: generations. These ideas didn't die with Plato. They infected educational systems, military training programs, and civic planning for centuries. When Alexander the Great's empire spread Greek culture across 3 continents, it carried Platonic prejudices about good versus corrupting art along with it. As you head toward your own home, you pass the academy, Plato's school, still lit by oil lamps. Inside, students are probably debating the ideal ratio of lyres to flutes in a proper education, or whether Homer's poetry is too emotionally destabilizing for impressionable minds. You shake your head. Tomorrow, there'll be another regulation, another restriction, all because one brilliant, insufferable man convinced powerful people that philosophy should govern every aspect of human experience, including when you're allowed to enjoy a drink and some music after a long day. You wake the next morning to discover that Plato's musical crusade isn't even the strangest philosophical overreach Athens has witnessed. You're heading to the market for breakfast when you overhear 2 vendors arguing about beans. Not the price of beans, not the quality, whether beans should exist in civilized society at all. One vendor is a follower of Pythagoras, the mathematician mystic who died over a century ago but whose cult is still thriving in pockets throughout the Greek world. The other vendor thinks this is absolutely insane. You're inclined to agree with him, but you stop to listen anyway because the Pythagorean is getting weirdly intense about legumes. Beans contain the souls of the dead, he insists, clutching a clay pot protectively to his chest. Eating them is no different from cannibalism. You blink. The other vendor laughs so hard he nearly knocks over his olive display. But the Pythagorean isn't joking. In communities following Pythagorean teaching, fava beans are genuinely forbidden, and in some places, local authorities have had to create exceptions in food distribution laws because these communities refuse to accept bean rations. Pythagoras himself, that legendary figure who gave you the theorem you suffered through in school, was apparently obsessed with beans in a way that made Plato's music fixation look reasonable. According to his followers, he taught that fava beans were sacred and dangerous, containing fragments of human souls in their early stages of reincarnation. The exact reasoning varies depending on which ancient source you trust. Some say beans resemble human fetuses, others claim beans lack joints and therefore connect directly to the underworld, and one particularly weird tradition suggests that if you bury a bean in mud and return after 40 days, it'll have transformed into something that looks disturbingly like a human head. You're trying to process this when the Pythagorean vendor starts explaining the Great Bean Incident that nobody outside his community talks about. Allegedly, Pythagoras himself died because he refused to cross a bean field while fleeing enemies. Rather than trample the sacred plants, he stopped running and was killed. Historians still argue whether this story is literal truth, propaganda from rival philosophical schools, or metaphor that got taken too seriously. But the result is the same: actual communities organized around the principle that beans are spiritually radioactive. You purchase some bread from a non-Pythagorean vendor and wander toward the gymnasium, where you know these philosophical types gather. Sure enough, there's a small group of them, identifiable by their white clothing and refusal to eat anything that was once alive, which, combined with the bean prohibition, makes their diet impressively restrictive. They're vegetarians, which sounds progressive until you realize it's based on the belief that your dead grandmother might currently be a chicken. One of them is lecturing a confused athlete about the dangers of training after eating beans, claiming they cause flatulence that disrupts the soul's harmony. Here's where it gets legally complicated. Some Greek city-states actually had to accommodate Pythagorean dietary restrictions in official contexts. When these communities grew large enough, magistrates conducting public sacrifices and feasts had to provide alternative foods. Military commanders dealing with Pythagorean soldiers had to ensure bean-free rations. It sounds absurd, but you're watching it happen in real time, a philosophical preference becoming a logistical mandate because the followers are numerous, wealthy, or politically connected enough to demand exceptions. The quirky historical tidbit that makes this even stranger: Pythagoreans also refused to eat certain fish, pick up anything that had fallen on the ground, and wear wool because it came from animals. They couldn't look in mirrors at night, had to put their right shoe on first every morning, and were forbidden from breaking bread with their hands. It had to be torn. These weren't suggestions. These were rules that governed entire communities, complete with social consequences for violations. You strike up a conversation with a young Pythagorean who seems less militant than the bean vendor. He explains that the prohibition isn't really about beans specifically, it's about maintaining spiritual purity in a cosmos governed by mathematical harmony. Pythagoras discovered that musical intervals correspond to numerical ratios, and from there concluded that numbers are the fundamental reality underlying everything. Beans, somehow, disrupt this cosmic mathematics. The logic is fuzzy, but the commitment is absolute. What's fascinating is how this one man's peculiar dietary restrictions cascaded into community laws that lasted centuries after his death. In Croton, where Pythagoras founded his original community, his followers essentially controlled the government for a time, enforcing their lifestyle choices as civic policy. They banned certain foods from public distribution, regulated what could be sold in markets, and created a two-tiered society of initiates and outsiders. It's the ancient equivalent of a wellness influencer becoming mayor and outlawing gluten. You notice the Pythagorean checking his right shoe obsessively, making sure it's properly secured before the left one. He catches you watching and explains matter-of-factly that the right side represents the divine, the left represents the material and corrupt. Starting with the right shoe aligns you with cosmic order. You nod politely, wondering how many other arbitrary rules are disguised as profound philosophy. The scholarly debate around Pythagoreanism centers on whether it was genuinely a mathematical religious movement or essentially an elaborate ancient conspiracy theory that happened to produce useful geometry. The mathematics was revolutionary, the Pythagorean theorem, the discovery of irrational numbers, the numerical basis of musical harmony. But the lifestyle rules were bonkers, and somehow both traveled together through history. As you leave the gymnasium, you pass a shrine where someone has left an offering of fruit, carefully arranged to avoid any beans. A small placard explains that the shrine honors Pythagoras, who taught that the universe is number and that beans are evil. You shake your head, marveling at how one brilliant mathematician's weird food hang-ups became religious doctrine, then civic accommodation, then a permanent quirk of Greek culture. Somewhere, a magistrate is probably drafting regulations about bean-free zones in public spaces, all because a guy who died 100 years ago was really convinced that legumes contained grandma. You're trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon in the agora when you notice a commotion near the public fountain. A crowd has gathered, and they're laughing, jeering, pointing at something you can't quite see. You push through the onlookers and immediately regret it. There's Diogenes of Sinope, the most infamous philosopher in Athens, squatting in a large ceramic jar he calls home, and he's doing exactly what you think he's doing. In broad daylight. In the middle of the marketplace. With absolutely no shame whatsoever. If only it were so easy to relieve hunger by rubbing an empty belly, he announces to anyone within earshot, completely unfazed by the scandal he's causing. You watch as a horrified magistrate rushes over, demanding that Diogenes stop immediately and show some basic human decency. Diogenes looks up, genuinely confused. What's indecent about satisfying a natural urge? Dogs do it. Why shouldn't humans? The magistrate sputters, searching for legal language to address a situation no lawmaker ever anticipated needing to prohibit explicitly. This is the problem with Diogenes. He's taken cynic philosophy, the idea that humans should live according to nature, rejecting social conventions and material possessions, to its logical, horrifying extreme. He owns nothing but a cloak, a staff, and that jar he sleeps in. He eats whatever he can scavenge, including raw meat. He insults everyone from beggars to Alexander the Great with equal enthusiasm. And he performs bodily functions wherever and whenever the urge strikes, because nature demands it. You've heard the stories. Everyone has. Diogenes once masturbated in the marketplace and, when confronted, said he wished he could cure hunger by rubbing his stomach. He urinated on people who insulted him. He defecated in the theater during performances he found boring. He carried a lamp in daylight, claiming he was looking for an honest man and never finding one. The man is a walking philosophical protest against civilization itself, and Athens is scrambling to figure out how to legislate around him. Here's where it gets legally interesting. Diogenes' actions forced Athens to clarify what public indecency actually meant. Before him, there were vague social norms about appropriate behavior, but nothing codified. Most people understood you didn't masturbate in public because, well, obviously. But Diogenes demanded philosophical justification for every social convention, and when none was forthcoming, at least none he accepted, he violated them systematically and publicly. The magistrate you're watching is part of a new wave of officials who've had to define boundaries that were previously implicit. They're drafting laws that specify which bodily functions can occur where, what constitutes public lewdness, and how natural philosophy cannot be used as a defense for antisocial behavior. It's awkward work. Imagine having to write legislation that explicitly states no public masturbation because one guy keeps arguing that dogs do it, so why can't he? Historians still argue whether Diogenes was a genuine philosopher making profound points about the arbitrary nature of social norms, or just a provocateur who enjoyed shocking people. Ancient sources can't quite agree either. Plato supposedly called him a Socrates gone mad, which is either an insult or the highest compliment depending on your perspective. What's undeniable is that his antics required legal responses. You watch as the magistrate finally gives up trying to reason with Diogenes and instead addresses the crowd, explaining the new decency ordinances that will be posted in the agora by week's end. There will be designated areas for certain activities, he announces. Public urination will be restricted to specific facilities. Sexual acts, even philosophical demonstrations thereof, will be prohibited in shared spaces. The crowd murmurs approval, except for a few cynics in the back who start arguing that all property is theft and therefore no space is truly public. The quirky part of Diogenes' legacy is that he actually won some arguments. His critique of material wealth resonated widely. His mockery of pretentious philosophers became legendary. When Alexander the Great visited Athens and found Diogenes sunbathing, the emperor asked if there was anything he desired. Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Alexander was so impressed he reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." So this naked guy living in a jar somehow commanded respect from the most powerful man in the world while simultaneously forcing lawmakers to specify that you can't just whip it out whenever philosophy strikes. You notice another cynic philosopher nearby, one of Diogenes' students, eating raw octopus straight from a bucket. He's watching the confrontation with amusement, probably planning his own demonstration of living according to nature. The movement Diogenes sparked, cynicism, would influence Stoicism, which would influence Roman law, which would influence Western civilization. But right now, in this moment, it's just a bunch of dirty philosophers making everyone uncomfortable and forcing bureaucrats to write extremely specific prohibitions. The magistrate approaches you, assuming you're a witness. He asks if you saw what happened, whether you can testify about the exact nature of the offense. You're not sure how to describe what you saw in language suitable for an official legal proceeding. He sighs, understanding your hesitation. Just say he violated community standards of public conduct, he suggests. We'll work out the precise wording later. As you leave, you glance back at Diogenes, who's now lecturing the remaining crowd about how shame is a social construct designed to control the masses. He's not wrong, exactly, but he's also definitely not making friends. A group of children has started throwing fruit at him, which he catches and eats without interrupting his monologue. You shake your head, marveling at how one man's commitment to living like a dog created an entire body of law defining civilized human behavior. Remember that crocodile done sunscreen from some other historical weirdness? This is somehow worse. At least that was just ineffective cosmetics. This is philosophy as public nuisance, requiring governmental response. The afternoon sun beats down, and you head home, grateful that at least your neighbors believe in walls. You're summoned for jury duty 3 weeks later, and you're already dreading it. Not because you're lazy or unpatriotic, Athenian citizens take their democratic responsibilities seriously, but because you know what's coming. Ever since Socrates turned his own trial into a philosophical interrogation that lasted for hours and ended with him drinking hemlock, the courts have been a mess. You arrive at the Dikasteria, the large open-air court, and take your seat on a wooden bench alongside 500 other citizens who've been randomly selected to hear today's case. The defendant hasn't even spoken yet, and already someone is raising procedural questions that sound suspiciously Socratic. The case is straightforward, or should be. A merchant is accused of selling watered-down wine and mislabeling the amphory. Simple fraud. But the defendant has hired a reader, a professional speechwriter, who's clearly studied Socrates' method. Instead of defending his client's actions, he's questioning the nature of fraud itself. What is deception? He asks the jury. If a man believes his wine to be of adequate quality, is he truly lying? And who defines adequate? Can 500 men agree on the essence of adequate wine? You groan internally. This is going to take all day. Here's what Socrates did to Athens. He made questioning everything seem not just acceptable, but virtuous. His famous method, the elenchus, the cross-examination technique where he'd ask definition after definition until his opponent contradicted themselves, was supposed to expose false knowledge and lead to truth. In practice, it meant every conversation became an exhausting philosophy seminar. When he was put on trial in 399 BCE for corrupting the youth and impiety, he didn't defend himself like a normal person. He questioned the charges, questioned the court's authority, questioned whether death was even bad, and basically talked himself into a death sentence that a simple apology might have avoided. You watch as the defendant's lawyer continues his Socratic routine. Let us examine what we mean by wine, he proposes. Is it the grape? The fermentation? The container? If I add water, at what precise percentage does wine cease to be wine? The prosecutor looks ready to strangle someone. The presiding magistrate keeps glancing at a new set of procedural rules that were instituted specifically to prevent this kind of nonsense. Those rules exist because of Socrates. After his trial became legendary, simultaneously a martyrdom for free thought and a masterclass in how to annoy literally everyone, Athens had to modify its legal procedures. Time limits were introduced for speeches. Definitions of common terms were standardized to prevent endless philosophical regress. Juries were given clearer instructions about what constitutes relevant testimony versus abstract speculation. The entire system had to be Socrates-proofed. Historians still argue whether Socrates actually intended to die or simply miscalculated how annoying he was being. The accounts vary. Plato presents him as a noble truth-seeker willing to die for principle. Xenophon suggests he was getting old and preferred death to decline. Aristophanes, who mocked him mercilessly in plays, implies he was a sophistic fraud who got what he deserved. What everyone agrees on, his trial changed Athenian legal culture permanently. You shift on the hard bench as the defense continues. Honorable jurors, consider, is any wine truly pure? Does not all water contain minerals? Does not all alcohol derive from water at some stage? This is exactly the kind of argument the new rules are supposed to prevent, but the lawyer is technically staying within his time limit and addressing the charges, just in the most philosophically tedious way possible. The quirky historical detail that makes this worse, Socrates' method was so effective at undermining people's confidence in their own knowledge that Athens became paranoid about sophists, traveling teachers who charged money to teach rhetoric and argumentation. The city passed regulations requiring sophists to register with authorities, limiting what they could teach, and in some cases banning them entirely from working with young men under a certain age. The fear was that professional arguers would create a generation incapable of accepting any claim without exhaustive questioning, which, ironically, was exactly what Socrates had been doing for free. You notice several jurors have fallen asleep. Others are passing around a wineskin, presumably to test the defendant's product firsthand. The magistrate clears his throat and invokes a new rule. The defense must connect his philosophical inquiries to the specific charges within the next 5 minutes or forfeit his remaining time. The lawyer adjusts his approach but can't help himself from one more Socratic jab. I merely seek to ensure we all understand what we're judging, he says innocently. Surely that's not prohibited? What's fascinating is how Socrates never wrote anything down. Everything we know about him comes from Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes, all of whom had different agendas. The real Socrates is unknowable. But the impact of his interrogation method is undeniable. It spawned Plato's Academy, which influenced 2,000 years of Western philosophy. It created the dialectical method still used in legal education. And it forced Athens to create procedural safeguards against people who weaponize questioning. The prosecutor finally gets his chance to respond, and he's had enough. This man sold bad wine, he states flatly. We have witnesses. We have the wine. We have the mislabeled containers. Either convict him or don't, but let's stop pretending this is a philosophy lecture. The jury applauds. You applaud. Even some of the defendant's supporters look relieved. The vote happens quickly after that. Guilty. Moderate fine. The whole thing could have been resolved in an hour if not for the Socratic shenanigans. As you file out, you overhear jurors complaining about the new breed of defendants who think every trial is an opportunity to debate epistemology. Socrates died so these idiots could waste our time, one mutters. It's not quite accurate, but you understand the sentiment. You head home as the sun sets, grateful that your civic duty is complete. Tomorrow, maybe you'll avoid the agora entirely. Between Plato's music police, Pythagoras' bean cult, Diogenes' public performances, and now Socratic lawyers turning fraud cases into philosophy seminars, Athens is becoming exhausting. And you're starting to suspect this is only the beginning. You're hired 3 months later to work on a public construction project, rebuilding a section of the city walls damaged in the last skirmish with Sparta. It's honest work, good pay, and you're looking forward to something straightforward after all the philosophical chaos you've witnessed. But on your first day, the project supervisor calls everyone together with a frustrated expression that immediately puts you on edge. We have a problem, he announces. The council wants to know when we'll be finished, and thanks to Zeno of Elea, I genuinely don't know how to answer that question anymore. You blink. Zeno died decades ago, before you were born. How is a dead philosopher causing construction delays? The supervisor explains, and you realize Athens has reached a new level of philosophical absurdity. Zeno was famous for his paradoxes, logical puzzles that seemed to prove motion was impossible, that you could never actually reach your destination, that arrows couldn't really fly. His most famous paradox goes like this: to walk across a room, you must first walk halfway. Then you must walk half the remaining distance. Then half of that. Since you can always divide the remaining distance in half, you'd need to complete an infinite number of steps, which is impossible, therefore motion is impossible. Obviously, this is nonsense, people walk across rooms all the time, but the logical problem it poses has philosophers tied in knots. Now, apparently, it's tying construction projects in knots too. The supervisor shows you a new city ordinance requiring that all public works contracts specify a completion definition that accounts for philosophical objections to infinite divisibility. You read it twice. It still doesn't make sense. He explains, a contractor on another project tried to avoid penalty fees for delays by arguing, in front of the city council, that the project could never technically be complete because perfection requires infinite refinement. You can always improve the work a little more, divide the task into smaller subtasks, add one more detail. Therefore, completion is conceptually impossible, so the deadline was unfair. The council, staffed by men educated in philosophy, couldn't immediately refute this. They'd all studied Zeno. They knew the paradoxes. And so instead of laughing this contractor out of the room, they launched into a 6-hour debate about the nature of completion, whether public works exist on a continuum or in discrete states, and whether Zeno's paradoxes apply to physical labor or only abstract mathematics. By the end, they were so confused they had to commission a report from the Academy, Plato's school, about the metaphysics of construction projects. You're staring at the wall section you're supposed to rebuild, and now you're infected with the same doubt. When exactly will this be finished? When the last stone is placed? But what about the mortar between stones, should that be perfectly smooth? And what about the measurements, accurate to what degree? If you can always be slightly more precise, slightly more perfect, does finished even exist? Historians still argue whether Zeno actually believed motion was impossible or whether he was just showing that our concepts of space and time lead to logical contradictions. Most scholars think he was defending his teacher Parmenides, who claimed that reality is unchanging and that all perceived motion is illusion. The paradoxes were meant to support this by showing that motion leads to absurdity. But in Athens, where educated citizens genuinely wrestle with these ideas, the practical consequences are real. Your supervisor has decided on a workaround that's now becoming standard. The contract specifies not just what needs to be built, but measurable criteria for sufficient completion. The wall must be X cubits high, Y cubits thick, using Z quality stones, with mortar gaps no larger than a specified fraction. Once those criteria are met, it's complete, paradoxes be damned. It's essentially defining completion operationally rather than philosophically, which works for construction but feels like intellectual surrender. The quirky part is that Zeno's paradoxes actually did contribute something valuable to mathematics. They forced Greek thinkers to grapple with infinity, continuity, and the relationship between the discrete and continuous. This eventually led to better geometry, early calculus concepts, and sophisticated mathematical proofs. But in the short term, in your immediate experience, they're just making it harder to build a wall. You spend the morning hauling stones and mixing mortar, trying not to think about infinite divisibility. But one of your co-workers, a young man who studied briefly at the academy before his family's money ran out, can't help himself. Technically, he says, carefully placing a stone, I'm never actually touching this stone. There's always infinitesimally small space between my hand and the surface. And the stone never truly touches the wall for the same reason. So really, we're building a wall of stones that hover near each other without contact. You tell him to shut up and keep working. But he's right in a weird way that makes your head hurt. If you can infinitely divide space, then contact, actual touching, might be impossible. Everything would be separated by infinitesimal gaps. The wall you're building is held together by forces acting across distances you can't see or measure. Philosophy has turned simple masonry into an existential crisis. By midday, the supervisor has to break up an argument between two workers about whether they've moved a supply cart or merely created the illusion of movement through a series of static positions. This is what Zeno has done to Athens. A century after his death, his brain teasers are still disrupting civic life, forcing legal definitions of concepts everyone previously understood intuitively. The council's solution, demanding measurable completion criteria, actually becomes influential. It spreads to other city-states, gets refined over time, and eventually contributes to more rigorous contract law. But standing here in the hot sun, covered in stone dust, listening to philosophical debates about whether motion exists, you just want to finish the wall and go home. As the day ends, you look at the section you've completed. It's definitely there. It's definitely higher than when you started. You definitely moved stones from one place to another. Zeno's paradoxes be damned, you think, work gets done. But tomorrow you'll have to fill out paperwork certifying the work meets the philosophical completion standards, and the absurdity of that will haunt you. You're invited to a dinner party 2 weeks later, a welcome break from construction work and philosophical headaches. Your host is a wealthy merchant who's made his fortune importing spices, and he's promised an evening of excellent food, good wine, and pleasant conversation with no mention of dead philosophers. You arrive at sunset, optimistic that tonight will be normal. You're immediately proven wrong when you see the guest list includes several followers of Epicurus, the philosopher who's recently been teaching that the goal of life is pleasure, and apparently everyone in Athens has misunderstood him catastrophically. The dinner starts innocently enough. There's roasted lamb, fresh fish, honeyed figs, bread still warm from the oven. Then one of the Epicureans, a well-dressed young man who clearly comes from money, announces that according to his master's teachings, he's entitled to as much of everything as he wants because pleasure is the highest good. He proceeds to pile his plate absurdly high, grab 3 cups of wine simultaneously, and declare that anyone limiting their consumption is philosophically unsound. Your host's smile becomes strained. Here's what Epicurus actually taught: pleasure is the goal of life, but he defined pleasure as the absence of pain and disturbance, achieved through simple living, friendship, and philosophical contemplation. He advocated for moderate eating, mainly bread and water, with occasional luxuries as treats. His own community lived frugally in a garden outside Athens, sharing meals and conversation. But somehow, maybe inevitably, when you tell people pleasure is the highest good, a significant percentage here eat everything, do whatever feels good, consequences don't exist. You watch as another Epicurean demands the host bring out more expensive wine, citing philosophical necessity. A third is flirting aggressively with someone else's wife, explaining that sexual pleasure is natural and therefore virtuous. The actual Epicurean teaching about sex was cautious. Epicurus warned that romantic passion causes disturbance and should be approached carefully, but that nuance is lost on this guy, who's now reciting poetry about hedonistic freedom while his hand wanders where it shouldn't. Your host pulls you aside, clearly stressed. This is the 3rd dinner party this month that Epicureans have ruined, he whispers. Last week one of them ate so much he vomited in my atrium, then claimed it was philosophically justified because purging allows for more pleasure. The week before, two of them got into a fistfight over the last piece of honeycomb, both arguing they had greater philosophical claim to it. The situation has gotten bad enough that Athens is considering sumptuary laws, regulations limiting consumption at private gatherings. Not because the city cares about excess generally, but because these philosophical gluttons are using Epicurus as justification for behavior that's destroying social harmony and, more practically, bankrupting hosts who feel obligated to provide unlimited food and drink to guests claiming philosophical entitlement. Historians still argue whether these excesses represented genuine misunderstanding of Epicurean philosophy or deliberate misrepresentation by people who wanted license for hedonism. The answer is probably both. Some followers genuinely thought seek pleasure meant maximize sensory indulgence. Others knew better but found the philosophy useful cover for gluttony and licentiousness. Either way, the result was a PR disaster for Epicureanism and a regulatory nightmare for Athens. You notice one of the Epicureans has started a debate with a Stoic guest about whether pleasure or virtue should guide life. It's a legitimate philosophical question, but it's happening at a dinner party, and the Epicurean is drunk and keeps using sexual metaphors that make everyone uncomfortable. The Stoic is trying to maintain dignified composure while explaining that self-control and reason should govern appetite, but he's also clearly furious and on the verge of punching someone. The quirky historical detail, the actual Epicurean community, living in their garden, were known for being remarkably restrained. They were vegetarians by preference, drank moderately, and spent most of their time discussing philosophy and cultivating friendship. Epicurus himself suffered from chronic illness and advocated for minimal luxury precisely because he knew from experience that pleasure is fragile and easily disrupted by excess. The garden community was essentially ancient hippies, focused on peace and simple living. Meanwhile, their name was being used across Athens to justify obscene consumption. Your host finally loses patience when an Epicurean demands he slaughter another lamb because philosophical fulfillment requires fresh meat. "Get out," he says quietly. "All of you. Out of my house." The Epicureans protest, citing their philosophical rights to pursue pleasure. Your host, a practical businessman with no philosophical training, responds with devastating simplicity, "Your pleasure is causing me pain. By your own logic, we have competing claims. I own the house. I win. Leave." They leave, grumbling about people who don't understand philosophy. The remaining guests exhale in relief. The Stoic refills his wine cup with shaking hands and mutters something about how Epicureanism is poison disguised as wisdom. You don't entirely agree, you know enough to recognize that Epicurus's actual teachings are more sophisticated than his followers suggest, but you understand the frustration. The next morning, you hear that the city council is drafting new regulations for symposia and private gatherings. Hosts will have the right to expel guests regardless of philosophical justification for their behavior. There will be limits on how much food and wine can be demanded. Philosophical necessity will no longer be accepted as legal defense for property damage or overconsumption. It's all necessary because Epicurus, trying to promote a gentle philosophy of modest pleasure and friendship, accidentally gave entitled jerks a vocabulary for demanding unlimited everything. You pass the Epicurean garden on your way to work and see the actual community there, sharing a simple breakfast of bread and olives, discussing philosophy in quiet voices. They look peaceful. Content. Nothing like the chaos of last night. One of them notices you watching and waves. "We heard about the dinner party," he calls out. "Those aren't real Epicureans. Epicurus taught that excess leads to pain, not pleasure. Simple living is the path to happiness." You nod, believing him. But you also know it doesn't matter. The brand is ruined. Athens will remember Epicurean as meaning hedonistic glutton, and laws will be written accordingly, all because philosophy is much easier to misunderstand than to practice correctly. You're teaching your nephew his letters a month later when a city herald announces a new educational mandate that makes you stop mid-lesson. All citizens educating children must now follow the curriculum framework established by Aristotle, former tutor to Alexander the Great and current director of the Lyceum. You read the proclamation twice, confused. Since when does Athens dictate how fathers teach their sons? The answer, it turns out, is since Aristotle wrote it all down in such meticulous detail that politicians decided his system was too good not to enforce. You visit the Lyceum the next day to understand what you're now legally obligated to teach. The school is impressive covered walkways where students stroll while discussing philosophy, a library that's rumored to contain hundreds of scrolls, gardens organized by plant type for botanical study. Aristotle himself is lecturing to a group of young men, and you stand at the back to listen. He's explaining that education must follow natural development, gymnastics and music for young children to train body and character, then reading and mathematics, then rhetoric and philosophy for older students. It sounds reasonable until he starts specifying exactly which musical modes are appropriate for which age groups and why certain types of poetry will corrupt youth if introduced too early. Here's what happened. Aristotle spent years as Alexander's private tutor, developing educational theories that helped create history's most successful conqueror. When he returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum, he systematized everything he'd learned into a comprehensive educational philosophy. He wrote treatises on logic, ethics, politics, physics, biology, and rhetoric. He created taxonomies for animals, plants, governments, and virtues. And he argued that education should follow scientific principles, with specific subjects taught in specific sequences at specific ages to produce ideal citizens. The Athenian government, always nervous about being surpassed by other city-states and deeply impressed by what Aristotle's methods did for Alexander, decided to mandate his approach. Now there are official inspectors who verify that teachers are following Aristotelian curriculum guidelines. You're required to teach geometry before advanced arithmetic, ethics before politics, and logic before rhetoric. Deviation results in fines or loss of teaching privileges. You watch Aristotle demonstrate how to categorize animals by their method of reproduction, their habitat, and their physical characteristics. He's created a whole system of genus and species that his students must memorize. It's brilliant and exhausting. One student asks why they need to know so much detail about fish. Aristotle responds that true knowledge requires understanding causes and categories, not just memorizing facts. The student looks skeptical but writes it down anyway. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's educational system was genuinely superior or just happened to be promoted by people with political power. His logic became foundational to Western thought. His scientific method influenced centuries of inquiry. But his specific claims that women have fewer teeth than men, that heavy objects fall faster than light ones, that the heart is the seat of intelligence, were often wrong. Yet for generations, students were required to learn these errors as facts because Aristotle said so and Athens made it law. The quirky part is that Aristotle himself valued empirical observation and encouraged questioning. He dissected animals, collected specimens, and revised his theories based on evidence. But the educational system built on his work became rigid and dogmatic, treating his texts as unchallengeable truth rather than starting points for investigation. You're seeing this transformation happen in real time as administrators turn philosophical treatises into mandatory curriculum. You approach one of the Lyceum teachers after the lecture and ask about flexibility in teaching methods. Can you emphasize music more if your student shows talent? Can you skip sections that seem irrelevant? He shakes his head sympathetically. The curriculum is set. There are progression requirements. If your nephew is tested and found deficient in any Aristotelian subject area, you'll face penalties. The council wants standardization. What's fascinating is that this standardization represents Athens trying to systematize excellence. They've watched Aristotle produce brilliant students. Alexander conquered the known world. Theophrastus will inherit the Lyceum and advance botanical science. Numerous other students became influential politicians and scholars. The city wants to replicate those results at scale. But you can't bottle genius, and you definitely can't mandate it through curriculum requirements. You return home with an official scroll listing the required subjects, the order they must be taught, and the standard students must meet at each age. Your nephew looks at it with horror. This will take years, he complains. You nod. That's the point. Aristotle believed education should be comprehensive and lifelong. The problem is that not every child needs to know Aristotle's complete taxonomy of everything to live a good life. Over the following weeks, you discover that other fathers are just as frustrated. Some are hiring tutors who claim Aristotelian expertise but are really just making it up. Others are bribing inspectors to overlook curriculum violations. A small rebellion is forming among parents who think Athens should stay out of their homes and let them educate their children as they see fit. But the law is clear, backed by a council convinced that Aristotelian education is the key to maintaining Athenian excellence in a changing world. The irony, which you can't help noticing, is that Aristotle himself was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates, 3 generations of philosophers who each rejected their teacher's core ideas and developed original systems. Socrates questioned everything, Plato built elaborate metaphysical theories, Aristotle grounded philosophy in empirical observation. They learned by disagreeing. But now Athens is trying to create cookie-cutter Aristotelians, which feels like exactly the opposite of what made those philosophers great. You sit with your nephew that evening, trying to make Aristotelian logic entertaining. He's bored within minutes. You remember learning from your own father through stories, practical examples, and hands-on work. It was messy and unsystematic, but you turned out fine. Now you're supposed to follow a predetermined path designed by history's most organized mind, and somehow it feels both more rigorous and less effective. Remember those Epicureans demanding unlimited food at dinner parties? At least they were just annoying. This is the government restructuring childhood itself because one philosopher was too convincing. Section 8. You're running errands in the Agora 3 weeks later when you nearly trip over a man sleeping on the ground, using a dog as a pillow. This wouldn't be shocking, you've grown accustomed to Diogenes and his jar, except this isn't Diogenes. This is one of his students, part of a growing movement of cynics who've decided that living like animals is the highest form of wisdom. There are now dozens of them scattered throughout Athens, and the city is desperately trying to define what civilized behavior means before the entire marketplace becomes a kennel. You step carefully around the sleeping cynic and his canine companion, heading toward the pottery stalls. But everywhere you look, there are more of them. One is eating scraps from the ground, explaining to horrified onlookers that cooked food is an unnecessary luxury that distances humans from nature. Another is urinating against a public column, arguing that dogs don't use latrines, so why should he? A third is engaged in what appears to be a loud, public argument with his own shadow about the nature of existence. The name cynic literally comes from the Greek word for dog, kynikos, and these philosophers have embraced it completely. They've rejected property, employment, family ties, and social conventions. They own nothing, contribute nothing, and spend their days demonstrating that humans can survive with less than anyone thought possible. It's philosophical performance art, and it's making Athens unlivable. You watch as a city official, you recognize him from the council meetings you've had to attend for the construction work, attempts to have a conversation with one of the cynics. You cannot defecate in the fountain, he says slowly, as if speaking to a child. We've discussed this. There are public latrines. The cynic looks genuinely confused. Why is one hole in the ground acceptable and another not? Both are natural. Both serve the same function. Your distinction is arbitrary. The official's eye twitches. You can see him mentally composing new regulations. Here's the legal problem, Athens never needed laws saying don't defecate in the fountain because everyone understood this instinctively. Social norms handled it. But cynics reject social norms as artificial constructs that corrupt natural human goodness. They demand philosophical justification for every convention, and when the justification seems weak, and it often does, because many conventions are arbitrary, they violate the convention publicly and dramatically. The city's response has been to create an entirely new category of law, behavioral minimums for public spaces. These laws don't prohibit crimes exactly. They establish baseline standards of conduct that everyone previously took for granted. No sleeping in merchant stalls. No eating from the ground in food preparation areas. No public sexual activity, even between consenting adults. No storing waste in shared water sources. The fact that these things need to be written down is embarrassing, but the cynics have forced the issue. Historians still argue whether cynic philosophy was genuinely about virtue through simplicity or just an elaborate justification for antisocial behavior. The original Cynic teachings emphasized self-sufficiency, freedom from desire, and shamelessness in the face of social pressure. In theory, this could lead to admirable independence and moral courage. In practice, it led to philosophers shitting in fountains and calling it enlightenment. You notice a group of young men watching the Cynics with fascination. This is Athens' real fear, not that a few eccentrics are behaving badly, but that they're recruiting. Young aristocrats, bored with traditional education and responsibility, are attracted to a philosophy that says all their family's expectations are meaningless social constructs. You can just opt out, live freely, and call it wisdom. It's seductive, especially to teenagers. The quirky historical detail, some Cynics actually did achieve remarkable feats of self-discipline and courage. Crates of Thebes gave away his entire fortune to live as a Cynic and was reportedly happy and influential. Hipparchia, one of the few female philosophers of the era, chose Cynic life over a traditional marriage and became a celebrated teacher. But for every genuine philosopher, there were 10 who were just homeless provocateurs with a vocabulary. You're pulled from your thoughts by shouting. Two Cynics are fighting over a discarded fish head, both claiming superior natural right to it. They're literally growling at each other, on all fours, snapping like dogs. A crowd gathers. Some people are laughing. Others look disgusted. The city official from earlier returns with 2 guards, and you see him consulting a scroll, the new behavioral codes, probably, trying to determine which specific regulation these Cynics are violating. The guards attempt to separate the fighting philosophers, but one of them bites a guard's hand. Actual biting. The guard yelps and drops him. The Cynic looks smug, as if he's proven a philosophical point about human and animal nature being identical. The official is writing frantically, no doubt adding no biting civic personnel to his growing list of regulations that shouldn't need to exist. What makes this situation legally complex is that the Cynics aren't technically breaking traditional laws. They're not stealing, they only take what's been discarded. They're not violent unless provoked, and they argue that self-defense is natural. They're not fraudulent or treasonous. They're just living in a way that makes communal life impossible and forcing Athens to articulate standards everyone else absorbed through normal socialization. You leave the agora earlier than planned, tired of navigating around philosophers who think personal hygiene is oppression. On your way out, you pass a newly installed sign listing prohibited behaviors in public spaces. It's embarrassingly long and specific. No sleeping in food preparation areas. No urinating except in designated facilities. No consuming food found on the ground where others are walking. No sexual activity visible from public thoroughfares. No storing personal waste. No biting. The list goes on. At the bottom, there's a note, these regulations apply regardless of philosophical justification. That line represents Athens' official exhaustion with Cynic arguments. You don't get to opt out of basic civilization just because you've convinced yourself that dogs have it figured out. That evening, you wash thoroughly, something Cynics consider unnecessary, and appreciate your simple home with its walls and roof. You think about how Diogenes started this by living in a jar and making provocative points about materialism. Now Athens has a population of people who've taken his critique too literally and need to be explicitly told not to behave like animals in shared spaces. Philosophy, you're learning, is dangerous when people mistake the metaphor for literal instruction. You're accompanying a surveyor to the riverbank a few weeks later, helping settle a property dispute between 2 landowners. It should be straightforward. One claims his property extends to the water's edge, the other says the boundary is marked by an old tree. But then someone mentions Heraclitus, and the entire proceeding derails into philosophical chaos. The surveyor groans audibly. You already know this is going to take all day. Heraclitus of Ephesus died generations ago, but his most famous statement has infected Athenian property law like a persistent disease: you cannot step into the same river twice. He meant it as a profound observation about constant change. The river is always flowing, always different, so the river you step into now is not the same river you stepped into a moment ago. It's a poetic way of saying reality is flux, everything changes, permanence is illusion. But when you're trying to establish legal boundaries based on a riverbank, this philosophy becomes a nightmare. One of the landowners, who studied at the academy and clearly regrets nothing about his education, starts arguing that since the river is constantly changing, any boundary defined by it is meaningless. The river today is not the river of yesterday, he announces, gesturing dramatically at the flowing water. The riverbank shifts. The current carves new channels. By Heraclitus's own logic, no boundary here can be fixed. Therefore, my property extends as far as the water has ever reached, because all those positions are equally the riverbank. The other landowner stares at him in disbelief. That's insane. By that logic, your property could extend to the sea. The philosopher landowner nods enthusiastically. Precisely. All boundaries are arbitrary impositions on a reality that refuses to be bounded. The surveyor drops his measuring tools and sits down heavily on a rock. Here's what Heraclitus actually created: a philosophical framework for understanding change and permanence. He argued that logos, a kind of cosmic reason or pattern, governs the constant flux. Fire was his symbol for this eternal transformation. Everything flows, everything changes, but underlying patterns persist. It's actually a sophisticated view of reality. But in Athens, where educated citizens love to weaponize philosophy, it's become an excuse to question the stability of anything defined by natural features. You watch as the surveyor tries to explain that, for legal purposes, the riverbank is wherever it currently is, measured on the day of survey. The philosophical landowner objects. But it's already different than when you started that sentence. The water has flowed. Particles have eroded. We're attempting to freeze something that definitionally cannot be frozen. He's not wrong, exactly, but he's being deliberately obtuse in a way that makes you want to push him into his precious changing river. Historians still argue whether Heraclitus intended his philosophy to have practical applications or whether he was purely concerned with metaphysics. His writings survive only in fragments, many of them deliberately obscure. He was called the obscure and the riddler even in ancient times. But the fragments that do survive have given Athenian intellectuals endless ammunition for complicating simple matters. The surveyor eventually consults a new set of regulations that were established specifically for properties adjacent to water. These rules define riverbank operationally. It's measured at normal water level during the dry season, marked physically with boundary stones, and surveyed every 5 years. Changes due to gradual erosion or deposition belong to the adjacent property owner. Sudden changes due to flooding are handled differently, with complex formulas for reassigning boundaries. The quirky part? These regulations exist in multiple city-states now, all because Heraclitean philosophy made it impossible to trust natural boundaries. Similar rules have been created for coastlines, streams, even lakes. Anywhere water touches land, there's now an elaborate legal framework to prevent people from claiming that change invalidates ownership. It's essentially Heraclitus-proofing property law. But the philosopher landowner isn't done. He's moved on to arguing that since he himself is constantly changing, his cells regenerating, his thoughts evolving, the he who agreed to the original property boundaries no longer exists. I'm literally a different person than who signed that contract, he insists. You cannot step into the same river twice, and you cannot hold the same person to an agreement twice. This is the moment the surveyor threatens to have him arrested for wasting civic time. You watch the other landowner, a simple farmer who probably can't read, become increasingly agitated. Just measure the damn property, he finally shouts. I don't care about rivers or philosophy. I care about where I can plant crops without him claiming it's his. The surveyor seizes on this. Finally, someone sensible, he mutters, and begins measuring from the tree, the one fixed point everyone can agree on. The philosophical landowner continues protesting, but the surveyor invokes a recent legal precedent. Heraclitean arguments about constant change cannot be used to avoid property obligations. The law recognizes that while reality may be in flux, civic life requires stable agreements. If you want to argue metaphysics, go to the academy. If you want to own land, accept that boundaries get fixed regardless of what's flowing where. What's fascinating is that this entire regulatory framework represents Athens trying to preserve practical governance while still honoring its intellectual tradition. The city is proud of its philosophers. Heraclitus is respected. But there has to be a point where philosophy stops and functioning society begins. That point, apparently, is property surveying. As you walk back toward the city, you reflect on the absurdity of the morning. A profound insight about the nature of change and permanence has been reduced to a legal loophole for greedy landowners. The surveyor, walking beside you, shakes his head. I became a surveyor because I like simple geometry and clear measurements, he says. Now I need to study philosophy just to tell people where their property ends. You pass the river on your way home, watching the water flow endlessly downstream, never the same twice. Heraclitus was right about that. But he probably didn't imagine his poetic observation would require civic authorities to create multi-page regulatory frameworks just so neighbors could stop arguing about whose land includes which wet rocks. Tomorrow, apparently, there's a similar dispute involving a stream, and someone's already cited Heraclitus in the preliminary hearing. The surveyor is considering a career change. You're summoned to court again 6 months later, and this time you're not even a juror, you're a witness in what has become the strangest trial Athens has ever conducted. The defendant is a merchant accused of selling defective pottery, a straightforward commercial dispute. But his defense attorney has invoked the philosophy of Parmenides, arguing that change is impossible, therefore the pottery couldn't have become defective, therefore his client is innocent. The prosecutor looks like he wants to climb into one of the defective jars and seal himself inside forever. Parmenides of Elea, the teacher whose ideas Zeno defended with those impossible paradoxes, taught something even more radical than motion being an illusion. He argued that change itself is logically impossible. Reality is one, eternal, and unchanging. All perceived change, all motion, all generation and decay, it's all illusion. What exists has always existed and will always exist in exactly the same state. Birth, death, transformation, these are tricks of the senses, not true features of reality. You watch as the defense attorney explains this to a jury of 500 increasingly confused citizens. The pottery my client sold, he argues, exists in an eternal, unchanging state. If it appears cracked now, it was always cracked. If it appears whole in the past, then it remains whole in the present. The contradiction proves that change is illusory. Therefore, there is no defect that occurred, there is only being, eternal and perfect. Several jurors are rubbing their temples. One has fallen asleep. The prosecutor presents the broken pottery as evidence. It's clearly, undeniably cracked. The attorney waves this away. Your senses deceive you. Parmenides proved through pure logic that what is, and what is not. Change would require something coming from nothing or becoming nothing, both of which are impossible. Therefore, this pottery has always been in its current state, and my client cannot be held responsible for an eternal condition. Here's where it gets legally insane. Athens has had to create a special category of defense called philosophical impossibility, which allows defendants to invoke metaphysical arguments but requires them to pay triple damages if the jury rejects the philosophy. It's the city's way of saying, fine, argue that reality is an illusion, but you're betting money on it. This merchant is risking financial ruin because his attorney thinks Parmenides is more convincing than physical evidence. Historians still argue whether Parmenides was describing ultimate reality beyond sensory perception or just following logic to absurd conclusions to prove that pure reason has limits. His poem on nature divides understanding into the way of truth, unchanging reality, and the way of opinion, deceptive appearances. Most scholars think he was trying to show that logic alone, without empirical observation, leads to paradoxes. But in Athens, his philosophy has become a template for denying obvious facts. You're called to testify because you witnessed the pottery sale. The attorney cross-examines you using Parmenidean logic. You claim you saw my client sell this pottery months ago, he begins. But the you who witnessed that sale no longer exists, that person has changed, cell by cell, thought by thought. The you testifying now is not the same you who was present then. Your testimony is therefore unreliable. You try to explain that you're still the same person, just older. He shakes his head. Change is impossible. Either you're identical to that past witness, in which case no time has passed and this trial is happening simultaneously with the sale, or you're different, in which case you're a stranger with false memories. The prosecutor objects, citing the new regulations about Parmenidean arguments in legal proceedings. The judge consults a scroll that now includes guidelines for handling philosophical defenses. There's a specific section on Parmenides. Arguments about the impossibility of change cannot be used to deny documented commercial transactions. If a sale occurred and was recorded, it occurred, regardless of what logic says about being and non-being. The quirky historical detail, Parmenides' philosophy actually inspired important developments in logic and mathematics. His insistence on rational proof over sensory experience influenced Plato and, through him, Western philosophy. The idea that reason can access truths beyond appearances is foundational to science. But in the immediate term, in this courtroom, it's just a sophisticated way to lie about selling broken pottery. The defense attorney, sensing defeat, shifts tactics. Even if we accept, for argument's sake, that change occurs, several jurors sigh in relief, we must acknowledge that the defect in the pottery is not absolute. It's a relation between the pottery and your expectations. In ultimate reality, the pottery simply is. Your disappointment with its state is your problem, not my client's. This is actually worse than the Parmenidean argument because it's philosophically defensible and morally repulsive. You watch the jury deliberate. They're not discussing philosophy. They're discussing whether merchants should be allowed to sell garbage and hide behind dead philosophers. The verdict is swift, guilty. The pottery was defective. Change happens. People can be held accountable for selling bad products. And because the defense invoked philosophical impossibility, the merchant owes triple damages plus court costs. The merchant looks devastated. His attorney is already drafting an appeal based on Zenonian paradoxes about infinite divisibility of payment. The judge threatens him with contempt. The prosecutor thanks you for your testimony and mutters something about how Athens needs to ban philosophy students from practicing law. As you leave the courthouse, you notice a group of young men from the academy debating Parmenides in the portico. They're discussing whether motion exists, whether plurality is possible, whether the world of appearances has any reality at all. It's intellectually stimulating. It's also completely divorced from the practical world where people buy pottery, use it, and expect it not to shatter immediately. You think about the regulatory evolution you've witnessed. Athens started with common sense and social norms. Then philosophers questioned everything. Then the city had to codify what everyone already knew, creating laws that explicitly state, yes, change happens, yes, you can step in rivers, yes, you're responsible for what you sell even if some dead guy proved logically that nothing ever transforms. That evening, you check your own pottery carefully, grateful that it's whole and functional. Tomorrow, you might wake up to discover it's cracked, and according to Parmenides, it was always cracked, you were always checking it, and this moment is eternal and unchanging. But you'll still need to buy new pottery, which proves that however interesting these philosophical puzzles are, reality keeps moving forward with or without logical permission. Remember that Epicurean demanding unlimited food because pleasure is the highest good? At least he acknowledged change, specifically, the change from hungry to full. Parmenides would argue he was never hungry and never full, just eternally and unchangingly himself. You're starting to think the Epicurean had the right idea. You're working on the city walls again when news spreads through the construction crew that stops everyone mid-task. Empedocles, the famous philosopher from Sicily, has thrown himself into Mount Etna to prove he's immortal. The plan, apparently, was to vanish without a trace so people would assume he'd ascended to godhood. The plan failed because the volcano spat out one of his bronze sandals, which is now being passed around Sicily as evidence that philosophers should really think their demonstrations through more carefully. Athens, meanwhile, is scrambling to pass laws about public suicide as philosophical performance art. You sit on a half-built wall section, listening to your co-workers debate whether Empedocles was brave or stupid. One argues he was making a serious point about the four elements earth, air, fire, water that compose all reality, and returning to elemental fire was poetically appropriate. Another points out that he's still dead, which somewhat undermines any claims about immortality. A third is laughing so hard about the sandal that he can't contribute anything useful. Here's what Empedocles actually taught: everything in the universe is made from four fundamental elements, held together by love and driven apart by strife. These cosmic forces cycle eternally, creating and destroying worlds. He believed in reincarnation, claimed to remember his past lives, and insisted he was divine. His philosophy combined sophisticated pre-Socratic physics with mysticism, poetry, and what appears to be massive ego. He reportedly wore purple robes, bronze sandals, and a golden crown, and he healed the sick, controlled winds, and raised the dead, or so he claimed. The volcano jump was supposed to be his ultimate proof. Disappear into fire, leave no body, force everyone to conclude he transcended mortality. Instead, Etna coughed up his footwear like the universe itself was calling bullshit. You'd feel bad for him except that he apparently told people beforehand what he was doing, which transforms tragedy into farce. You return to Athens that evening to find the city council in emergency session. The issue, Empedocles isn't the first philosopher to attempt suicide as philosophy, and he won't be the last. There's a growing trend of thinkers using their deaths as demonstrations of their ideas. Socrates drank hemlock calmly to prove he wasn't afraid of death. That was legally mandated execution, so it doesn't count, but it inspired imitators. Now Athens needs to establish whether it's legal to kill yourself to make a philosophical point, and whether the city has any obligation to stop you. Historians still argue whether Empedocles actually jumped into Etna or whether the story is apocryphal, invented by rivals to mock his pretensions to divinity. Ancient sources disagree. Some say he jumped, some say he died of natural causes, some claim he actually did disappear and the sandal story is slander. But the legal consequences in Athens are real regardless, because even the rumor of philosopher suicide has created panic among civic leaders. The council's debate is predictably philosophical. One faction argues that suicide violates natural law and civic duty. Citizens belong to the state, which invested in their education and expects their contribution. Killing yourself is theft of civic resources. Another faction argues that bodily autonomy is absolute. If someone wants to jump in a volcano, that's their choice. A third faction suggests that public spectacle suicide should be prohibited while private suicide remains legal, which creates the absurd question of how public is too public. The quirky detail, Empedocles isn't remembered primarily for his death. His four-element theory dominated scientific thinking for 2,000 years. Medieval and Renaissance scholars built entire systems of medicine, alchemy, and natural philosophy on his framework. The idea that everything is earth, air, fire, and water, in various proportions, shaped Western science until the modern chemical revolution. So this guy who died in the most ridiculous way imaginable actually contributed foundational ideas that outlasted nations. You watch as the council eventually settles on a compromise. Suicide isn't illegal, but public suicide as philosophical demonstration is prohibited and will result in confiscation of property and denial of proper burial rights. The punishment applies posthumously, which is weird, but the goal is deterrence. They don't want Athens becoming famous as the place where philosophers dramatically kill themselves to prove points about metaphysics. There's also a provision about suicide notes. If you leave writings explaining that your death proves a philosophical theory, your estate can be sued by anyone who considers the argument unconvincing. This is the council's way of saying, if you're going to die for an idea, the idea better be really good. It's probably unenforceable, but the symbolism matters. You think about Empedocles standing at the crater's edge, absolutely convinced he's about to transform into pure elemental fire and achieve divinity. The confidence required for that leap is staggering. The wrongness of that confidence is demonstrated by the sandal currently making its way around the Mediterranean as a philosophical punchline. There's something tragic and absurd about the gap between his self-perception and reality. A fellow worker asks your opinion on the new suicide laws. You shrug. If someone wants to die, laws won't stop them. But making it illegal to turn death into street theater seems reasonable. He nods. Though I wonder what counts as philosophical demonstration versus regular suicide. If I jump off a bridge while thinking about Heraclitus, is that illegal? You both laugh, but it's a genuine legal question now. The next day, you hear that the Stoics are protesting the new regulations. Their philosophy teaches that wise men have the right to exit life rationally when continued existence serves no purpose. Forcing people to live against their reasoned judgment violates Stoic principles. The council is unmoved. Exit life quietly, they respond. Do it at home. Write about it later if you survive. But no more theatrical volcano jumps or public hemlock demonstrations. You pass a street corner where someone has set up a shrine to Empedocles, complete with a bronze sandal as a relic. People are leaving offerings and prayers. Apparently, some believe he did achieve divinity and the sandal is a holy artifact. Others visit just to laugh. Philosophy has created yet another social phenomenon that nobody knows how to regulate properly. That night, you dream about philosophers jumping into Mount Etna one after another, each convinced they'll be the one who proves immortality, each producing only footwear. You wake up unsettled. The line between profound wisdom and dangerous delusion seems thinner than you'd like. Empedocles genuinely believed he was divine. He built an entire philosophical system around it. And then he jumped into a volcano and became a cautionary tale about the limits of self-belief. Athens has now created legal structures to prevent similar spectacles, but you suspect it won't work. Philosophers will always find ways to die dramatically for their ideas. The city can only clean up afterward and try to discourage imitators. You're negotiating a labor contract 3 months later when the entire transaction grinds to a halt over the word indivisible. You're trying to hire workers for another construction project, and the contract specifies that each laborer provides 1 indivisible unit of work per day. Simple enough. But one of the prospective workers studied under Democritus, the philosopher who theorized that everything is made of atoms, indivisible particles that can't be split further. He's now arguing that since nothing is truly indivisible, the contract is philosophically unsound and therefore unenforceable. You stare at him. It just means you work the whole day. You don't split the day between multiple employers. He shakes his head vigorously. But Democritus proved that everything can be divided down to fundamental particles. Even a day's work can be broken into smaller increments, hours, moments, breaths. There's no such thing as an indivisible unit of labor. This contract violates atomic theory. You resist the urge to explain that atomic theory has nothing to do with employment contracts, because you know from experience that philosophy students are immune to common sense. Here's what Democritus actually discovered. He proposed that all matter is composed of tiny, uncuttable particles he called atoms, moving through void. Everything you see, touch, taste, it's just atoms in different arrangements. This was remarkably close to modern atomic theory, discovered 2,000 years before anyone could prove it empirically. He also theorized that the soul is made of especially fine atoms, that perception happens when atoms from objects meet atoms in our sense organs, and that the entire universe operates mechanistically without divine intervention. The problem is that Athenian workers have latched onto atomic theory as justification for arguing that labor contracts can be infinitely subdivided. If you can split matter into atoms, why can't you split a workday into atomic units and sell them separately? One worker wants to sell you 3/7 of a day's work for 3/7 of a day's wage, keeping 4/7 for another employer. Another insists that since atoms are constantly moving and rearranging, his labor from morning isn't the same as his labor in afternoon, so you need separate contracts for each. You consult with the project supervisor, who shows you a thick scroll of new labor regulations created specifically to handle Democritan arguments. Indivisible in contracts now has a legal definition separate from its philosophical meaning. It means the contracted service must be performed as a complete unit without subdivision, regardless of what atomic theory says about the ultimate nature of matter. The worker can philosophize all he wants on his own time, but contractually, he owes you 1 full day. Historians still argue whether Democritus was a materialist eliminating need for gods or a natural philosopher simply describing physical processes. His atomic theory was one of several competing explanations for reality. Empedocles had his 4 elements, Anaxagoras proposed infinite divisibility of matter, others suggested various combinations. Democritus's atoms won the historical argument, but in ancient Athens, they created immediate contractual chaos. The quirky part is that Democritus himself was reportedly cheerful, practical, and nicknamed the laughing philosopher because he found human folly amusing rather than tragic. He traveled widely, studied mathematics and astronomy, and wrote extensively on ethics as well as physics. He probably would have found the labor dispute hilarious of workers using his profound insights about matter to weasel out of work commitments. The prospective worker isn't finished arguing. Democritus also taught that perception is subjective, that atoms from objects create appearances that differ between observers. So your perception of one day's work might differ from mine. We need to establish whose atomic configuration determines the standard. You close your eyes, counting to 10. The supervisor intervenes, pointing to the new regulations. Perception clauses are prohibited in labor contracts. Standard work periods are defined by public sundials, verified by civic officials, non-negotiable. What's fascinating is watching Athens create an entire parallel legal vocabulary to prevent philosophical concepts from destroying practical governance. Every major philosopher has required this. Plato's forms needed legal grounding. Heraclitus's flux needed boundaries. Parmenides's unchanging reality needed exceptions. Now Democritus's atoms need contractual firewalls. The city is essentially building a barrier between abstract truth and functional society. You finally offer a compromise. The worker can believe whatever he wants about atoms, but legally he'll work sunrise to sunset for agreed wages, just like everyone else. He reluctantly accepts, but insists on adding a footnote to the contract stating that his agreement doesn't constitute endorsement of non-atomic labor theory. You allow it because the footnote is legally meaningless and it gets him to sign. As workers are hired and contracts finalized, you overhear two of them debating whether slavery itself is defensible under atomic theory. One argues that since all humans are just atoms in different arrangements, there's no fundamental difference between free and enslaved, therefore slavery is ethically arbitrary. The other counters that the soul atoms of free men are qualitatively superior to slave atoms. You walk away before the argument escalates. Philosophy has infected everything, even the most brutal institutions. The next week, a slave brings a legal petition arguing that his master cannot claim ownership of something that's constantly shedding and replacing atoms. The slave my master purchased years ago no longer exists atomically, the petition reads. I'm literally a different collection of atoms. Therefore, the ownership claim is invalid. The courts reject this immediately, citing the same regulations that prevent Heraclitean change arguments in property disputes. But the attempt shows how deeply philosophical concepts have penetrated even the most oppressed classes. You return to the construction site, where workers are now arguing about whether the stones they're placing are truly touching or just held by atomic forces across infinitesimal voids. Remember when you nearly tripped over that cynic sleeping with his dog? This is somehow more exhausting. At least the cynics were just gross. These workers are trying to philosophize their way out of actual labor using theories about invisible particles. The supervisor eventually bans all discussion of Democritus during work hours. I don't care if reality is atoms or elements or whatever else, he announces. While you're on my site, reality is stones, mortar, and walls. Build them or leave. It's the most sensible thing you've heard in months. Several workers continue muttering about reductionist materialism being intellectually limiting, but they keep working. That evening, you wonder what Democritus would think of his legacy. He discovered foundational truths about matter and motion. He advanced natural philosophy tremendously. And in Athens, his insights are being used primarily to complicate employment contracts and question whether anyone owes anyone anything because we're all just temporary arrangements of eternal particles. You're watching a public lecture on astronomy when the city guards arrive and arrest the speaker mid-sentence. The lecturer is Anaxagoras, one of Athens' most respected philosophers, teacher to Pericles himself, and he's just committed the apparently unforgivable crime of suggesting that the sun is a hot rock. The crowd gasps. Some people look confused, what's wrong with that? Others look genuinely horrified, as if he's proposed murdering children. You're somewhere in between, trying to understand how describing celestial bodies lands you in legal trouble. Anaxagoras is dragged away still protesting that he can prove his claims through observation and reason. The sun is roughly the size of the Peloponnese, he's shouting. The moon reflects the sun's light rather than generating its own. The stars are fiery stones. Eclipses have natural causes involving shadows and alignments. None of this sounds heretical to you, it sounds like astronomy. But the prosecutor following the guards is citing impiety laws, claiming that denying the divine nature of celestial bodies is an attack on traditional religion and therefore dangerous to the state. Here's what happened. Athens has always had an uneasy relationship between religious tradition and philosophical inquiry. Most citizens worship the traditional gods, participate in festivals, and believe that sun and moon are divine beings worthy of reverence. Then along comes Anaxagoras' teaching that these gods are just natural objects operating according to physical principles. No consciousness. No divinity. No hearing prayers or influencing human affairs. Just rocks and fire following natural law. You follow the crowd to the assembly where emergency proceedings are being held. Pericles, Athens' most powerful politician and Anaxagoras' student and friend, is attempting to defend him. His theories don't deny the gods, Pericles argues. They simply describe natural mechanisms through which divine will operates. The sun can be both a hot stone and sacred. It's a diplomatic attempt to bridge philosophy and tradition, but the prosecutors aren't buying it. He calls Helios a stone, one shouts. He says Selene is merely reflected light. He reduces the sacred to the material. This corrupts our youth and angers the gods. The crowd is divided. Some citizens, educated and philosophically inclined, think the charges are absurd. Others, more traditional, genuinely believe that questioning divine nature threatens cosmic order. Athens is splitting along intellectual fault lines. Historians still argue whether Anaxagoras was prosecuted for his astronomy specifically or whether political enemies used impiety charges to attack Pericles indirectly. Ancient sources suggest both motives operated simultaneously. But regardless of political intrigue, the result is the same. Athens passes new laws restricting what can be taught about celestial bodies, effectively censoring scientific inquiry in the name of religious propriety. The quirky historical detail, Anaxagoras was right about nearly everything he claimed. The sun is hot. The moon reflects sunlight. Eclipses result from alignments of celestial bodies. He even correctly explained why the Nile floods annually, melting snow from mountains in the south. His astronomy was centuries ahead of contemporary understanding. And Athens punished him for it, preferring comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. You watch as the assembly debates the new restrictions. Philosophers may discuss natural causes for terrestrial phenomena, rain, wind, earthquakes, but celestial bodies must be treated with reverence. Any teaching that explicitly denies divine status to sun, moon, or stars is prohibited. Teachers violating this will face impiety charges, which can result in exile or death. It's thought control dressed as piety protection. Pericles manages to negotiate Anaxagoras' sentence down from execution to exile. The philosopher leaves Athens, reportedly bitter but resigned. You hear him say on his way out that truth doesn't care whether it offends tradition, and Athens will regret choosing comfort over knowledge. He's probably right, but he's also leaving, and the laws remain. What makes this particularly frustrating is that Anaxagoras contributed more than controversial astronomy. He proposed that mind nous is the organizing principle of the cosmos, bringing order to matter. He developed sophisticated theories about how perception works and how knowledge forms. He mentored some of Athens' greatest leaders. And Athens is throwing it all away because he dared to suggest the sun doesn't have feelings. You notice young students in the crowd, watching their teacher being exiled for teaching what he believed was true. Some look angry. Others look frightened. A few look thoughtful, probably wondering what they're allowed to learn now, what questions are safe to ask. The censorship doesn't just silence Anaxagoras, it chills all future inquiry. Why study astronomy if honest conclusions lead to prosecution? The new laws create bizarre practical problems. Teachers must now carefully distinguish between natural philosophy, acceptable, and impiety, criminal, but the line is vague and politically determined. Can you study eclipses without explaining them? Can you calculate celestial movements without discussing their nature? Can you observe the moon's surface features without noting it resembles Earth? Every astronomy lesson becomes a legal minefield. Over following months, you watch as intellectual life in Athens contracts. Philosophers self-censor, avoiding topics that might offend religious sensibilities. Foreign teachers stop visiting, not wanting to risk prosecution. The Academy and Lyceum carefully monitor what's taught about the cosmos. Athens, which prided itself on wisdom and learning, has chosen enforced ignorance on certain subjects to maintain social cohesion. Remember that merchant who tried to use Parmenides to deny his pottery was broken? At least that was just fraud wearing philosophical costume. This is the state actively prohibiting true statements because they're inconvenient to traditional belief. It's worse. It's government deciding what reality you're allowed to acknowledge. You attend one more astronomy lecture after the laws pass, curious how teachers adapt. The lecturer carefully explains the movements of celestial bodies using only descriptive geometry, never mentioning their composition or nature. Every student in the room knows he's avoiding the real questions, dancing around truth to stay safe. It's education as performance, knowledge is something shameful that must be hidden. That night, you look up at the moon, knowing it's probably just reflected sunlight on a rocky surface, but legally required to at least pretend it might be a goddess. You wonder if Anaxagoras, wherever he's gone, is still looking up too, free to think what he knows is true without fear of punishment. Athens has gained religious comfort and lost scientific honesty. You're not sure the trade was worth it. You're attempting to navigate a contract dispute 6 months later when both parties cite Protagoras, and you realize Athens has reached peak philosophical dysfunction. Protagoras, the most famous sophist, those professional teachers of rhetoric and argumentation, famously declared that man is the measure of all things. He meant that truth is relative to the observer, that there's no absolute standard beyond human perception and judgment. It's an interesting epistemological position. It's also a legal catastrophe when both sides of a lawsuit use it to claim they're simultaneously right. The case involves a merchant who sold grain that the buyer claims was moldy. Simple enough. But the merchant has hired a sophist trained in Protagorean rhetoric who argues that moldiness is subjective. What appears moldy to my opponent appears acceptable to my client, he explains smoothly. Protagoras taught that reality is relative to the perceiver. Both perceptions are equally valid. Therefore, no fraud occurred, merely different subjective experiences of the same grain. The buyer's attorney looks ready to commit violence. Here's what Protagoras actually created, a philosophical framework questioning whether objective truth exists independently of human judgment. He taught that opposing arguments can be equally strong, that rhetoric and persuasion matter more than abstract truth, and that skilled speakers can make weaker arguments defeat stronger ones through technique alone. This made him wealthy. Wealthy citizens paid enormous fees for him to teach their sons how to win arguments regardless of facts. It also made him deeply controversial. You watch as the trial devolves into competing claims about the nature of reality. The buyer insists the grain is objectively moldy, any reasonable person can see and smell it. The merchant sophist argues that reasonable is subjective, that standards of acceptable grain vary between observers, and that imposing one person's standard on another violates Protagorean principles of relative truth. Several jurors look confused about whether they're judging a grain sale or the foundations of epistemology. The prosecutor, clearly prepared for this, produces Athens's newest legal innovation, the Objective Standards Act. This law establishes that certain facts are legally objective regardless of philosophical position. Quality of food, safety of construction, accuracy of weights and measures, these are not subject to Protagorean relativism. Expert inspectors determine standards, and contractual disputes use these determinations, not individual perceptions. Historians still argue whether Protagoras was a genuine relativist or simply a pragmatist teaching that persuasion matters more than truth in practical affairs. His book on the gods reportedly began, "Concerning the gods, I cannot know whether they exist or not," which got him exiled for impiety. His epistemology might have been sophisticated nuance about knowledge limits, but his students heard truth is whatever you can convince people to believe and ran with it. The quirky detail, Protagoras allegedly invented the professional teaching contract with a clever twist. Students paid half up front and half after winning their first court case using his techniques. One student, Euathlus, studied with Protagoras but then never practiced law, avoiding the second payment. Protagoras sued him. Euathlus argued, "If I win this case, the verdict says I don't owe you. If I lose, I've lost my first case, so contractually I don't owe you." Protagoras countered, "If you win, you've won your first case and owe me. If you lose, the verdict says you owe me." The case supposedly stumped Athens's courts completely. You watch as the grain dispute finally reaches resolution. The jury rejects Protagorean relativism, finds the grain objectively moldy based on expert testimony, and rules for the buyer. But the verdict includes a special notation: the defendant's legal fees cannot be recovered because invoking philosophical relativism in commercial disputes is now considered frivolous defense. Athens is financially punishing people for weaponizing Protagoras. What's fascinating is that this creates a two-tier system of truth. In philosophy classes, you can argue that everything is relative, that perception determines reality, that no objective standards exist. But in legal contexts, commercial transactions, and civic affairs, objective truth is mandatory. Athens has essentially said, philosophize all you want, but in the real world, moldy grain is moldy grain. The broader consequence is that sophists, already controversial for teaching rhetoric over wisdom, become even more suspect. Athens starts requiring licensing for professional teachers, with restrictions on what can be taught and to whom. Young men under 18 cannot study with sophists without parental permission. Sophists must register with civic authorities and submit curriculum outlines. Teaching pure relativism without grounding in civic values becomes restricted. You leave the courthouse and immediately encounter a sophist offering lessons in the agora. Learn to make weaker arguments stronger, he advertises. Master the art of persuasion. Truth is what you make it. He's technically legal, licensed and registered, but he's also demonstrating why Athens needed regulations. He's selling the ability to lie convincingly and calling it education. A young man approaches the sophist, interested in lessons. You overhear their conversation. The student wants to learn how to win arguments with his father about his allowance. The sophist explains that with proper training, he can convince his father that receiving less money is actually receiving more, that spending is saving, that irresponsibility is wisdom. The student is delighted. His father, you think, is going to regret not censoring sophistic education sooner. That evening, you reflect on what Protagorean relativism has done to Athens. It's made every dispute potentially infinite. If truth is relative, why accept any resolution? It's turned education into cynical training in manipulation rather than pursuit of wisdom. And it's forced the city to explicitly legislate what counts as objective fact, which feels like admitting defeat. A functional society can't operate if everyone claims their own reality. Remember Anaxagoras getting exiled for saying the sun is a hot rock? That was Athens choosing comfortable myths over uncomfortable science. This is Athens choosing enforced objectivity over philosophical relativism. Both represent the city retreating from pure philosophy when it threatens practical governance. You're witnessing the boundaries of how much truth, or how much questioning of truth, a society can tolerate. The next day brings news of another sophist controversy. One has been teaching students to argue both sides of every question with equal conviction, a valuable logical exercise. But several students have taken this to mean that commitment to any position is foolish, that all values are equally arbitrary. They become nihilistic, mocking anyone who believes in anything. Their parents are demanding refunds and regulations. Philosophy has created a generation that can argue brilliantly but believes nothing. You fall asleep wondering if Protagoras understood what he was unleashing. Man is the measure of all things is profound when it questions dogmatic certainty. It's dangerous when it dissolves all shared standards. Athens is learning this distinction the hard way. You're summoned to the assembly one final time, 2 years after this philosophical chaos began, and Athens is debating the most comprehensive regulation yet, mandatory licensing for anyone who wants to teach philosophy professionally. The proposal is simple and devastating. If you charge money to teach rhetoric, logic, ethics, or natural philosophy, you must register with the state, pass examinations proving competence, and adhere to educational standards that prevent the kind of civic disruption you've witnessed across every area of Athenian life. The sophists are furious. The traditional philosophers are conflicted. And you're just exhausted. The council presents evidence systematically. Plato's musical regulations created enforcement nightmares. Pythagoras' bean cult required dietary accommodations. Diogenes' public indecency forced explicit behavioral codes. Socrates' questioning method broke legal procedures. Zeno's paradoxes disrupted construction contracts. Epicurean hedonism ruined dinner parties and required sumptuary laws. Aristotle's educational theories became mandatory curriculum. Cynics living like dogs necessitated civilization baseline standards. Heraclitus's flux philosophy complicated property rights. Parmenides's unchanging reality enabled commercial fraud. Empedocles' volcano jump created suicide demonstration prohibitions. Democritus's atoms undermined labor contracts. Anaxagoras' astronomy led to censorship laws. And Protagoras' relativism nearly destroyed the concept of objective legal standards. One counselor reads this list aloud, and the cumulative weight is staggering. Every single philosophical innovation of the past century has required legal response, he says wearily. We've written more laws about philosophy than about actual crimes. This cannot continue. The assembly murmurs agreement. Athens is tired. The city has been philosophically exhausted into submission. Here's what the licensing requirement actually means. Aspiring teachers must demonstrate knowledge of their subject, pass ethics examinations proving they won't corrupt youth, and submit to ongoing civic oversight. They must teach approved curriculum that balances philosophical inquiry with civic responsibility. They cannot make arguments that explicitly undermine legal standards, contractual obligations, or social cohesion. And they must carry insurance against damages caused by students misapplying their teachings. The sophists protest that this violates free inquiry and turns education into state propaganda. They're not entirely wrong. One sophist argues passionately that Athens is choosing comfortable ignorance over difficult truth, that regulating philosophy means regulating thought itself. Today you license teachers, he warns. Tomorrow you license what can be thought. Eventually, Athens becomes a city where only approved ideas circulate, where innovation dies, where philosophy becomes mere repetition of state-sanctioned doctrine. Historians still argue whether Athens's educational licensing represented pragmatic governance or intellectual tyranny. The regulations did reduce chaos, fewer construction delays from Zenonian paradoxes, fewer legal cases involving Parmenidean impossible change defenses, fewer dinner parties ruined by Epicurean excess. But they also created chilling effects on genuine inquiry, making philosophers cautious about challenging conventional wisdom. The quirky part is that the licensing system's architects studied philosophy themselves. They're not anti-intellectual. They're desperately trying to preserve both philosophical tradition and functional society. The proposed regulations include funding for the academy, the lyceum, and other schools that teach responsibly. It's not censorship exactly, it's mandatory responsibility. You watch as a young philosopher in training speaks against the regulations. He's maybe 20, earnest and idealistic. Philosophy means love of wisdom, he says. You cannot love wisdom while fearing consequences for where it leads. Every great philosopher questioned received truth. Socrates questioned everything and was executed for it. Now you want to prevent future Socrates by licensing who can ask questions? This is cowardice disguised as governance. The council member responding is older, exhausted, and gentle. We're not preventing questions, he explains. We're preventing weaponized philosophy. You can study Heraclitus without using him to avoid property taxes. You can learn Protagoras without claiming moldy grain is subjectively acceptable. You can appreciate Democritus without subdividing labor contracts into atomic increments. Philosophy should illuminate truth, not provide clever excuses for antisocial behavior. What's fascinating is watching Athens try to separate philosophy as wisdom from philosophy as excuse. The licensing requirements essentially demand that teachers help students distinguish between profound insights and sophistic manipulation. Teachers must show how Socratic questioning leads to truth, not just to undermining every conversation. How Epicurean pleasure means contentment, not gluttony. How Stoic virtue enables strength, not just judgmental superiority. The vote happens after hours of debate. The licensing requirements pass overwhelmingly. Starting next year, anyone teaching philosophy for money must register, demonstrate competence, and accept civic oversight. The sophists in attendance storm out dramatically. The traditional philosophers look relieved and troubled in equal measure. The general citizens just seem grateful that maybe, finally, they can conduct business without someone citing dead philosophers to avoid obligations. You leave the assembly as the sun sets over Athens, painting the Acropolis in golden shadow. The city has spent 2 years learning that brilliant ideas have messy consequences, that philosophy is powerful enough to reshape society and dangerous enough to require guardrails. Every philosopher you've encountered, from Plato to Protagoras, contributed genuine insights that advanced human understanding. But they also unleashed arguments and frameworks that destabilize daily life when taken too literally or applied too broadly. The next morning, you pass the academy, where Plato's students are already adapting to the new reality. They're developing curricula that teach philosophy while explicitly noting where philosophical arguments should not apply to civic life. It's an awkward compromise, truth with asterisks, wisdom with warnings. But it might be necessary. Athens has learned that unregulated philosophy can be as disruptive as unregulated commerce. You return to the construction site where you've spent so much of this period, where Zenonian paradoxes about motion once stopped work and Democritan atoms once complicated contracts. The walls are nearly finished now. The work happened despite philosophy, or maybe because of it. The regulations forced clarity about completion, divisibility, and responsibility. The stones are real. The mortar holds. The wall stands. Whatever Parmenides says about change being impossible, the wall exists where it didn't before. Remember when you nearly tripped over Diogenes' student sleeping with his dog, back when this philosophical invasion was just beginning? That moment seems almost quaint now. Athens has been systematically transformed by ideas, forced to articulate assumptions everyone previously shared implicitly, compelled to write laws about things that never needed laws before. Philosophy has made everything explicit, and explicit is exhausting. As you place one of the final stones, you think about what's been gained and lost. Athens understands itself better, its values, its structures, its assumptions all examined and tested. But it's also more regulated, more defensive, more suspicious of pure inquiry. The city has chosen function over philosophical freedom, or at least tried to balance them through licensing and oversight. The wall is finished just as the sun reaches its peak. You step back, surveying the completed work. It's solid, functional, and real. No paradoxes, no relativism, no atoms or flux or unchanging being, just stone arranged by human hands into protective structure. Philosophy may describe reality, but walls defend cities. Athens has remembered which matters more.